Evidence, emails, and secret recordings revealed a tangled web of bribery, backdoor deals, and the misuse of taxpayer funds, exposing the shocking truth behind Mayor Tiffany Henyard's rise to power. The image she had so carefully crafted, that of a smooth-talking, unassailable political figure, began to crumble. Once dominating Dalton's political scene, her face plastered on billboards while she skimmed over questionable finances, Henyard now sat frozen in place, her face drained of color as the truth unfolded before her eyes. The residents of Dalton, her once loyal supporters, watched in stunned disbelief. The woman they had trusted for so long was being revealed as nothing more than a fraud. But it didn't end there. In a fit of rage, Henyard slammed her fist onto the table so hard the chair screeched across the polished floor. Standing up, she shouted, "This is a setup." Her voice cracked with frustration, but the room wasn't buying it. The judge's gavel struck down with authority, silencing her outburst. Henyard wasn't finished. Pointing a shaking finger at the prosecution, she screamed, "This is political. You don't want a strong woman." The irony hung thick in the air. Here was a woman accused of bullying local officials, inflating salaries, and funneling taxpayer money into mysterious projects, now trying to cast herself as a victim. It was classic Henyard, playing a martyr in a desperate attempt to salvage her image. In one final, futile attempt to control the narrative, she turned on her own lawyers. "You were supposed to handle this," she yelled, her voice dripping with contempt. One attorney awkwardly shuffled through papers, clearly embarrassed, while the other refused to meet her gaze. The cracks in Henyard's empire were now glaringly visible. For the first time in her political career, Henyard had no deflections, no spin, no control over the room. The truth had finally caught up with her. In a shocking move, she grabbed her designer handbag, ripped off her microphone, and stormed out of the courtroom. The room followed her exit in stunned silence. The once unstoppable Mayor of Dalton was abandoning the fight, but the silence didn't last long. The people who had been manipulated, lied to, and betrayed erupted into applause. Justice had arrived, and Henyard was running out of places to hide. The courthouse erupted into chaos as court officials banged their desks, shouting for order. Reporters scrambled to keep up with the fleeing mayor. "Did you see her face?" One resident laughed. "I told you she was a crook," shouted another. "This is what happens when you mess with the people's money." A third voice rang out. Inside the courtroom, Henyard's inner circle sat frozen, desperately trying to salvage what they could. Phones rang frantically as the fallout set in. No one was safe now. Outside, the media swarmed Henyard as she stormed down the courthouse steps. Her heels clicked furiously against the pavement, each step echoing in the tense air. Reporters bombarded her with questions. "Mayor Henyard, do you have a comment on the leaked recordings? Is it true that millions of taxpayer dollars are missing? Will you resign after the day's hearing?" Henyard remained silent, her face set in a hard mask of defiance as her security team tried to push the reporters away. But the press was relentless, forming an ever-tightening circle of questions, trapping her with no escape. Just when it seemed Henyard might slip away into the safety of her car, a voice broke through the chaos. A woman stepped forward, blocking her path. The former treasurer of Dalton, the woman who had resigned months earlier, citing suspicions of mismanagement and accusing Henyard of unethical conduct. Her eyes burned with fury as she faced a woman who once held so much power. Her voice was sharp, and for a brief moment, Henyard seemed caught off guard. The woman who had once controlled everything was now on the receiving end of an indictment, not just from the courts, but from someone who knew her all too well. Sensing the opportunity for even more drama, the media turned their cameras toward the confrontation. It felt like the final act in a long, painful saga. Would Henyard try to deflect, or had the truth finally cornered her beyond escape? The people of Dalton, who had watched this drama unfold for so long, now found themselves on the edge of history. Would this be the moment they finally saw their city freed from the grip of its controversial leader? Henyard stood in the middle of the media storm, and for the first time, she knew this was one fight she couldn't win. The air crackled with anticipation as reporters clicked away with their cameras. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. At the center of it all stood Tiffany Henyard, the so-called super mayor, once untouchable, now the personification of defiance. She had entered the courtroom with the same arrogance that had defined her political career. Chin held high, eyes brimming with unshakable confidence. Behind her stood a team of lawyers, likely paid with taxpayer money. But that didn't seem to faze her. Then came the bombshell. The prosecution unleashed a barrage of evidence that rocked the room. Leaked statements, emails, and recordings all revealed Henyard's involvement in bribery, backdoor deals, and the misuse of taxpayer funds. The room fell silent as the contents flashed across the courtroom's big screen. Every secret, every manipulation laid bare. Henyard, once known for her smooth talking and carefully crafted public persona, froze. Her mask cracked. She sat still, her face drained of color as the truth poured into the room like a flood. The residents of Dalton, who had once placed their trust in her, sat in stunned silence. The woman they believed in for so long was revealed for who she truly was. Not the powerful leader they thought they knew, but fraud, exposed. Her empire of lies was beginning to unravel before their eyes. But this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning. In a desperate, rage-fueled moment, Henyard slammed her fist onto the table, her chair screeching across the polished floor. She stood, her eyes blazing with fury, and screamed, "This is a setup." Her voice cracked with emotion, but the room remained unmoved. The judge's gavel pounded for order, but Henyard refused to back down. Pointing an accusatory finger at the prosecution, she shouted, "This is political. You don't want a strong woman." The irony in her words was thick. Here was a woman who had used her position to bully local officials, inflate salaries, and funnel money into dubious projects, now trying to cast herself as a victim. It was a classic Henyard move, playing the martyr when the walls were closing in, a desperate last-ditch effort to salvage her image. As the pressure mounted, Henyard turned on her lawyers. "You were supposed to handle this." She spat, her voice laced with contempt. One lawyer awkwardly shuffled through papers, clearly embarrassed, while the other avoided her gaze. In that moment, the room, the town, the cameras, the headlines, all knew Henyard had finally lost control. The other lawyer refused to meet her gaze. The cracks in Tiffany Henyard's carefully crafted empire were now impossible to ignore. The truth had finally caught up with her, and she had no answers, no spin left to offer. It was over. In a shocking and dramatic move, Henyard grabbed her designer handbag, ripped off her microphone, and stormed out of the courtroom. Audible gasps followed. For the first time in her political career, Henyard couldn't control the narrative. She was walking away from the fight, and the public was watching. The room, once thick with tension, now buzzed with whispers. The once unstoppable mayor was fleeing, and the power she had wielded over Dalton for so many years was slipping from her grasp. Then, something unexpected happened. The former treasurer of Dalton, the woman who had resigned months earlier after alleging financial mismanagement and corruption, stepped forward and blocked Henyard's path. This was the same woman who had been bullied and threatened by Henyard's administration. But now, she was determined not to let this moment slip away. She wasn't about to let Henyard walk off without facing the truth. "You can run out of court, but you can't run from the truth, Tiffany," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tense crowd. For the first time that day, Henyard faltered. She froze, just for a moment, a crack in her armor. The polished facade that had shielded her for so long was beginning to crumble. But the former treasurer wasn't finished. "You silenced all of us, but guess what?" She continued, her voice growing bolder as cameras clicked and rolled. The gathered crowd watched, the pressure mounting. Henyard, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated. Then, in an impulsive and reckless move, she stepped forward, getting inches from the former treasurer's face. In a low, threatening whisper, she muttered something under her breath. But Henyard had underestimated the power of live streaming. The former treasurer smirked, turned directly to the cameras, and declared, "You heard that, right? She just threatened me again." Within seconds, social media exploded. The hashtag began trending almost instantly, and the world watched as Henyard's political career unraveled before their eyes. The power dynamic had shifted. It was no longer Henyard dictating the narrative. Now the truth was out, and the people of Dalton were demanding answers. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, the hearing continued without her. Gone were the secret backdoor deals, the tightly spun lies, and, of course, the infamous recordings that had been hidden for so long. Without Mayor Tiffany Henyard there to control the room, the prosecution laid everything bare, unraveling the empire she had so carefully built. The evidence was overwhelming. It revealed a staggering $30 million in financial discrepancies. The room reacted with shock and disbelief as the truth behind Henyard's corruption became undeniable. The people of Dalton were finally having their moment. They had watched this political drama unfold for so long, and now, at last, the woman who had deceived them was exposed. Henyard's manipulations, lies, and deceit were laid out in the open, undeniable and damning. "Your Honor, "We have uncovered a series of financial transactions totaling over $30 million," the lead prosecutor said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the revelations. The room fell into stunned silence as the audience absorbed the enormity of the numbers. This wasn't a case of simple mismanagement or sloppy accounting. This was full-blown embezzlement. The prosecution clicked through a series of records, each slide sending fresh shockwaves through Courtroom. There were shell companies, fake invoices, and mysterious consulting fees, all pointing directly to Henyard and her closest allies. Then came the most damaging revelation. Some of those transactions weren't even tied to Dalton. They led to luxury properties in other states. Properties that should have represented investments in Dalton's infrastructure, public safety, and community programs had instead been funneled into high-end real estate elsewhere. The courtroom buzzed with one question: who owned those properties? The answer came, and it was devastating. Henyard's inner circle. Her closest advisors were implicated, and most damaging of all, her boyfriend was allegedly tied to several properties. The same boyfriend who had been conspicuously absent from the courtroom that day. And so, the pieces fell into place. The residents of Dalton, once loyal, once trusting, now watched in grim satisfaction as the house of cards collapsed. The truth, long buried under a mountain of spin, had finally broken through. And Tiffany Henyard, the so-called super mayor, was left with nowhere to run. The courtroom was electric with tension as the prosecution laid out the undeniable web of corruption. Tiffany Henyard's fate became painfully clear. There was no more room for doubt, no way to spin this as mere political mismanagement or a series of unfortunate mistakes. This was criminal behavior, intentional, malicious, and damning, and Henyard wasn't even present to defend herself. The judge, her voice booming with authority, made the monumental announcement. It is within this court's power to authorize an official criminal investigation into Mayor Henyard's financial dealings. A heavy silence fell over the room as the magnitude of the moment sank in. This wasn't just about political scandals or backroom deals anymore. It was now an official criminal investigation, one that could lead to federal charges. For the residents of Dalton, who had long whispered about Henyard's misdeeds, this was a long-awaited moment of justice. What had once been mere gossip and rumor was now a concrete case, a full-fledged legal pursuit with a potential for real, serious consequences. Henyard's days in power were numbered. As news of the court's decision broke, a crowd of Dalton residents gathered outside the courthouse. Their frustration, which had simmered for years under Henyard's rule, finally erupted into cheers and chants as the verdict filtered out. "Lock her up. We finally got her." The crowd roared, their voices rising a wave of triumphant energy. The atmosphere was electric, buzzing with the collective release of pent-up anger and betrayal. But Henyard, caught just a few blocks away in the center of a growing media frenzy, had no idea what was unfolding inside the courthouse. She still believed she could spin the situation, play the victim, twist the narrative, and regain control. What she didn't realize was that her empire was already crumbling. As the cheers outside grew louder, the grim reality of her situation began to sink in. For years, Tiffany Henyard had ruled Dalton with an iron fist. She had silenced critics, bullied whistleblowers, and manipulated the system with ruthless efficiency. But now, for the first time, the system was fighting back. Suddenly, her phone rang, the frantic voice on the other end unmistakable. "Madam Mayor, it's bad. Real bad." Henyard clenched her jaw, bracing herself. A beat of silence passed. Then the words tumbled out, sealing her fate. "The investigation is federal. They're coming after you." Her heart skipped a beat. Federal charges. This wasn't just another political scandal. This was a full-blown criminal case. And there was no escaping it. Henyard exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the weight of what was happening began to crush her. For the first time in her career, she had nowhere to run, no narrative to spin, no victory card to play. The power she had wielded with such ruthless precision was slipping through her fingers. Calls and messages kept coming in, but Henyard had already lost control. The leaks, the tapes, the mounting evidence. It was all too much. The life she had so carefully constructed, built on a foundation of corruption, intimidation, and deceit, was collapsing around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Inside the courthouse, the judge's decision was final. The criminal investigation was officially authorized. The truth had finally been confirmed, and no amount of political maneuvering could save Tiffany Henyard now. The people of Dalton, once silenced by her iron grip on power, were now seeing justice served. As the courthouse erupted into celebration, the chants of the crowd outside grew louder, demanding her imprisonment. Meanwhile, Henyard sat frozen in her car, the weight of her past actions bearing down on her. Her phone buzzed incessantly, but she didn't answer. The reality of her situation was sinking in. Federal charges were coming. She was no longer the untouchable political force she once believed herself to be. Her empire had crumbled. The truth had come for her, and there was nowhere left to hide. Tiffany Henyard had once been the most powerful, feared, and untouchable leader Dalton had ever known. A political force who had manipulated, bullied, and deceived her way to the top, ruling the city with an iron fist. For years, she had escaped the consequences of her actions, spinning narratives, intimidating critics, and silencing anyone who dared speak out. But now, everything had changed. She sat alone in her car, chaos unfolding around her. The cheers of the crowd outside grew louder, a stark contrast to the rising panic in her chest. Tiffany Henyard was no longer a powerful mayor. She was a fugitive from justice. Her grip on power had evaporated, and the world was watching her unravel. For the first time in her life, Tiffany Henyard felt completely isolated. The police officers who had once acted as her personal security detail were now law enforcement officials waiting for their orders. Her loyal staff, those who had once done her bidding without question, had scattered, leaving her with no support. Even her lawyer, who had stood by her side through every scandal, avoided her gaze, deepening her sense of abandonment. The man who had been with her through every crisis, her most trusted ally and at one time her biggest supporter, was nowhere to be found. Her boyfriend, the one who had stood beside her in the face of controversy, was now absent. Tiffany had burned too many bridges. And now, in her moment of greatest need, she stood alone. Panic gripped her heart, tightening its hold. She had always been able to talk her way out of tight situations, to manipulate the narrative, to escape the consequences. But this time was different. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, a cruel reminder of how quickly her world had spiraled into chaos. She stared at the screen but couldn't bring herself to answer. She already knew the truth. "They're coming after everything," she whispered to herself. Everything. Her administration's finances, her personal transactions, her hidden accounts, the luxury properties she secretly owned in other states. All were now under scrutiny. Panic slammed into her full force. The weight of the situation became unbearable. She glanced around desperately, searching for an escape, but there was no one left to help her. For the first time in her political career, Tiffany Henyard was completely alone. The consequences of her actions were no longer just a matter of public opinion. They were real, and they were coming for her. Across town, news channels were covering the unfolding chaos in real time. Headlines screamed, "Bombshell, Henyard under criminal investigation." Full financial probe into corruption scandal explodes. And then came the shock that Tiffany Henyard couldn't have anticipated. A whistleblower from inside her own office stepped forward, with devastating evidence. "I worked in that office for years," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I saw how the money moved, how taxpayer dollars were funneled into private accounts. And when I tried to speak up, I was threatened." The interviewer leaned in, wide-eyed. "Threatened by who?" Without hesitation, the woman replied, "By Tiffany Henyard herself." Gasps erupted from the audience. "You're saying Mayor Henyard directly threatened you?" The interviewer pressed. The whistleblower nodded, her voice growing steady with resolve. "Not just me. Anyone who got in her way." The camera zoomed in as the whistleblower pulled a small black recorder from her purse. "I have proof," she said calmly. The newsroom fell silent. The evidence was undeniable. Tiffany Henyard, the woman who had spent years using intimidation and fear to silence her critics, was now facing the consequences of her actions. The very people she had bullied and threatened were fighting back, armed with the proof needed to take her down. Back inside the courthouse, the prosecution wasted no time. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of disbelief when a request for a full federal investigation into Henyard's financial dealings was granted. The weight of the situation bore down on her. Once untouchable, once above the law, Tiffany Henyard was now facing the full force of law enforcement and federal authorities, poised to investigate her every move. Her reign, built on manipulation and fear, was crumbling. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had gathered in full force. Their cheers were loud and triumphant as news of Henyard's impending downfall spread like wildfire through Dalton, igniting both anger and celebration. "Lock her up," they chanted, holding up signs demanding accountability. Their voices rose in unison, twisting Henyard's own campaign slogans into brutal commentary on her years of corruption. The energy was electric as the people of Dalton celebrated what they had longed for, a chance at justice. And just as Henyard thought things couldn't get worse, they did. The first arrest warrant was issued not for her, but for someone very close to her, her top financial advisor. Reporters scrambled to confirm the breaking news. Sources revealed that authorities had issued the warrant for the high-ranking member of Henyard's administration. Then came the real shock. The FBI was now involved. The investigation had gone federal. Panic gripped Tiffany as she turned to her lawyer, her voice tight with desperation. "Fix this," she demanded. But instead of responding with his usual confidence, her lawyer gave her a look that spoke volumes. It said, "Even I can't save you now." At that moment, Tiffany Henyard fully grasped the gravity of her situation. She was no longer in control. The days of dodging accountability, brushing off accusations with a smile, and intimidating critics into silence were over. Her political empire, built on shady deals and corruption, was unraveling. The people of Dalton, who had suffered under her rule for so long, were no longer passive observers. They were celebrating. Outside her car in the streets, across news networks, demanding justice and reveling in her downfall. Tiffany, frozen in her car, watched her world crumble. This wasn't just another PR nightmare. This was the end. The people she had deceived, manipulated, and ruled over for years were finally seeing justice served, and there was no one left to save her.